light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I hope it's not offensive to anyone to mention that I'm an academic. I got a bachelor's degree in humanities and a master's degree in theological studies, and I'm now working on a doctoral degree in human development. And not because I'm trying to use these degrees to be impressive, but simply because I've always, from day one, I've always been someone who was fascinated with learning and with acquiring all the information I could. And in one sense, as an autistic, details are my first reality, and yet at the same time, it's usually the details that I find fascinating, unless it is something for which I don't know how to relate it to anything. It's something totally disconnected and, to me anyway, irrelevant. In all of this, I'm still an academic, I guess, because I read books and I study and I seek to learn things, but I also get kind of disenchanted with academia sometimes because I'm forever meeting professors and teachers who insist that they are committed to addressing social justice issues. What in the world is a social justice issue? And in trying to come up with a definition of that, it's usually things that have to do with the occurrence of justice or injustice, fairness or unfairness within a societal setting. But the thing that I noticed that I pointed out to them, because no one seems to be addressing it, is that there is no social justice issue that does not involve in some way or another economic disparity. And yet all these academia and people who said they were addressing social justice issues, who refused to address economic disparity because they wanted to be on the high end of the economic spectrum. And they were perfectly okay with someone doing without or not having enough or being poor, just so long as they had enough and they were fine. That, of course, is the mental illness of being narcissistic or selfish. Ultimately, what a world needs, what a community needs, is for each person in it to have enough. Political systems are about who makes the decisions. Economic systems are about how the money gets spread around. How much can one person hoard at someone else's expense, or how much does everyone have enough while allowing this person, if he or she works harder, to have a little bit more than they need. And that's okay if they want to work harder and get it, it's up to them. But at the same time, there's a balance there, because you also have greed, which is a mental illness. And if the person is experiencing a mental illness, something needs to assure them that it will be okay. There will always be enough. There will always be someone who cares about you, someone to be there to hold your hand. In modern industrialized society run by corporations, that is not always the case, because there isn't the tribe, there isn't the community to say, I will be there for you. There needs to be somebody who says, when all hell breaks loose and you are losing your home, we will make sure you have a home. And there are certain social welfare programs that are supposed to do that, but by and large they don't ever meet more, in my experience anyway, they don't meet more than 70 to 80% of the need. So you're always falling a little bit short, which is why we now have a phenomena called subsidized housing. The problem with subsidized housing is that initially everyone intended for it to be regulated appropriately, and that you have to maintain the home in good repair, and the plumbing has to be working, and the wiring has to be working, and the roof has to be solid, and all that stuff. And over time, so many people became homeless that the available homes couldn't keep up. And the more the system reached for people to provide homes for those who didn't have them, the more they allowed things that they normally wouldn't have allowed. And we wound up with people who had homes they didn't want the expense of fixing, who were instead renting them out to poor people who couldn't afford a home at the usual rate. And so it's what I have heard some people call slumlord situations. that there's somebody who owns a property, refuses to fix it, won't fix it, and if you harass them about it, they'll simply throw you out and let the next person move in, because there are so many people desperate for housing, because humanity has really not done a good job of taking care of each other. I try to be, just as an aside, I try to be careful in using the word American anymore, because we have Central and South America also. And I think it's supposed to be an abbreviation for the United States of America, but with that in mind, to more clearly express myself, I try to always say U.S. Americans as opposed to just Americans, because Americans technically applies to everybody from the tip of South America all the way to the tip of North America, and everybody in between. And there are a number of countries involved. And so, considering that those people count, and that they matter just as much as I do, not more, not less, but just as much, that all of us need to have enough. All of us need to have a place to live, adequate food, enough food to eat that we don't go hungry, all those sorts of things. And paying attention also to where our world is going, and how, if we're concerned about social justice issues, we have to be involved in addressing economic disparity, because there is not a single social justice issue that does not in some way involve economic disparity. Initially, when the Europeans came to North America 100 years ago and were moving west and displacing the Native Americans in ways that were positively horrific, and not paying attention to the types of housing that Native Americans had created that were remarkably in harmony with the surrounding environment, but in attempting to impose these other types of housing, log cabins and such, instead of teepees, or you're not paying attention to how in the world do you build a pueblo in the Southwest, because it's a rather complicated process. It's not difficult, and it can be done in a way that is very low tech, doesn't require heavy machinery or high technology, but there's a specific way to do it, and if you don't do it correctly, you will wind up with a house that doesn't stand. With all of that going on, the West began to bring, Western civilization began to bring more laws and more restrictions and more, it kind of goes back to Jimi Hendrix saying about when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. There is so much going on at the present time that values the love of power, and erroneously and irresponsibly creates control, and doesn't care how many people wind up homeless in the process. And with that broader awareness, with that inclusive awareness, instead of embracing the mental illness of narcissism and thinking only of yourself, to instead say that I need to survive, my neighbor needs to survive, my whole community needs to survive. There needs to be no one in my community who is fighting for survival, because if they are fighting for survival, they are not going to be able to contribute everything they otherwise could. My tombstone someday, I've suggested to people, should say I would have done so much more if I had not been fighting for survival so much. Because if I could have had my house and my food and everything secure, then I could focus on the writing and the creativity and making blankets for people and painting pictures that would offer insight and inspiration, taking us beyond ourselves. I mean, that's the bottom line of art, is that it's something that takes you beyond yourself and puts you in touch with a more creative and empowered way of being. That it's something that allows you to be more than you presently are, more than you would have been if you had never seen it or never felt it or never touched it. The trying to deal with this economic discrepancy and everything, and trying to find creative, constructive ways by which effort is rewarded. And if someone is dealing with a mental health issue that has gotten in the way of their making an effort, that they feel so devalued by the world around them that they have lost the ability to try, well, that's a mental health issue. and they need to believe in themselves. They need to be helped to have faith in themselves in order to begin to do whatever is necessary to fit into their particular society. And if the society is creating a system in which it decides who are the important people and who are the people who don't matter, that in itself is wrong. And the people who don't matter, what do you do with them? Or either you have to legalize euthanasia, or you have to find somewhere for them to be. Just having police officers to lock them up when they misbehave, well, of course they're going to misbehave. If they don't have a house, if they don't have the food they need, if they don't have the clothing they need, if they don't have the opportunities that they need, of course they're going to misbehave. You and I would do the same thing. One of the captions, or one of the quotes I have hanging on my wall that speaks to this point. It would seem that just about everyone knows Mahatma Gandhi, the man in India who actually became an attorney eventually, but he lived in a very poor fashion, and he advocated for nonviolent resistance, and in essence wound up leading the nation of India to independence from the British Empire. But in order to do that, a lot of people died in the process, and some horrific things happened. And yet, for his own integrity, he insisted on sticking to nonviolence, and no matter what, he was not going to become violent. He was going to define himself, and he was not going to allow the world around him to define who and what he was. The world was not going to make him violent if he didn't want to be violent, and he chose not to be violent. Well, one of his disciples was Miriam Slade, and she made the comment, "He who has more than he needs for efficient work is a thief." The idea being that every time you have more than you need and you are holding it yourself and refusing to share it, you're essentially stealing it from the person who needs it more than you do. At one point in time, after reading that, my conclusion was that everything should be where it can do the most good. And if I have something and I'm not using it and I don't need it, and I meet someone who does need it and could make better use of it, the only right thing for me to do is to give it to them. And to try to hope, or try to believe, I guess, that when the time comes for me to be in need also, that somebody will do the same for me. There are times that I give because I'm a giving person. It's probably the better way to put it. There are times when I give because I'm a giving person, but I can't always count on the other person giving back, because whether or not they give in return reflects who and what they are. And if they are a person who is dealing with the mental illness of narcissism, they will be glad to receive my gift, but they will not necessarily give anything in return. I sometimes jokingly say that we live in the age of P.T. Barnum, whose most remembered quote seems to be, "There's a sucker born every minute." The idea being that you get ahead by taking advantage of people, which of course is contrary to every spiritual and belief system that I've ever encountered, and ultimately is contrary to an ongoing dynamic of life. Because if you're always taking and never giving back, there was one author who referred to a book of unknown title as saying that within this book they had created a computer that would produce anything that humanity wanted, and the book ends with having an old man clutching a single piece of rock the size of a basketball floating in outer space, because they have literally consumed the entire earth, which is pretty ghastly to consider that we could consume that much. But the thing we have to remember is that the earth is a closed system, and things change form and place, but we're not adding anything to it, nor are we taking anything away from it. Everything has to be recycled, because it goes around and it goes around and it goes around again, and it has for thousands of years. The other quote I have on the bottom of this that I wanted to share with you was written by Howard Thurman, who I think was a Christian mystic ahead of his time. He was a black minister who became the first black minister of Boston University, but in writing about the ways that he experienced and expressed his Christianity, there's an inclusiveness to it and a mysticalness to it that is so inspiring to me and so mind-opening. He's really quite an amazing author to read, Howard Thurman. But he makes the comment, there is no moral justification for having food and a surfeit of creature comforts at one's disposal, while numberless people all over the world, in every country, are without the necessities to survive. How will we answer an extraterrestrial species someday when they ask, about a famine on Earth or a disaster that happened, and ask us what we did while that occurred, or immediately after that occurred, while that was going on, while the resulting conditions were happening there. And we would have to look at them and say, nothing. I did absolutely nothing. They were starving to death in this part of the world. They were trying to rebuild their houses in that part of the world. They had no more power lines in that part of the world and were thrown back into pre-industrial times with no electricity, and I did nothing. And on one hand, the joke is often made, I grew up Catholic, and so it was drilled into our heads that you have to finish what's on your plate because there are starving children in India. And the answer was always, well, then send it to them, for crying out loud, because we didn't want to finish it. And from one perspective, finishing what was on my plate did nothing to help them. And not finishing what was on my plate did nothing to help them. But the point was to instill awareness that there are starving people in the world and that we need to create efficiency within our own homes so that we have more to share. But the sharing part somehow always got lost in the shuffle. And as people are talking about being concerned about social justice issues, and economic disparity is one of them, but economic disparity is something you will find in virtually every social justice issue you can name. The people who do not have enough money to hire an attorney, who do not have enough money to buy a house, who do not have enough money to make their house energy efficient so that the power company is taking all their money every month, not allowing them to be adequately warm or to have adequate light or adequate whatever they need, because all the money is going into bills. If they had an energy efficient house, on the other hand, they would have more money to spend on what they needed, in addition to paying what they needed to for the energy to keep the house sufficiently warm. It has to do with deciding, first of all, that everyone matters and living like you believe it. Not just saying it, but actually pushing representatives to do it. Pushing the corporations out of government and reminding the elected officials that when I vote for you, that means you represent me. That corporation is not voting for you, and I don't care what advertising they put on television. I decide where my vote goes. And being assertive in that way, and deciding that the economic disparity is not good enough for me or my family or my neighbors or anyone in my community, and expanding that bit by bit so that community begins to take in the whole world. Ultimately, the entire human race is one gigantic family. And trying to decide who matters and who doesn't matter, somebody else is pointing their finger your direction at the same time, trying to decide whether or not you matter. And if you decide that someone else doesn't matter because they're not rich enough, or they're not the right race, or they're not the right religion, someone is going to point the same finger back at you and decide that you don't matter at some point. The way I phrased it was that life is a collaborative effort. Everyone takes turn being the one in need. The amusing thing about that is how many people don't want to take their turn, and they don't want to embrace their own mortality. I've shared it in another episode, but I'll mention it here too as well because it's amusing, and it drives home a good point. The man who argued with God for the right to take it with him, so to speak, all his wealth and everything he'd accumulated in life, he wanted to be able to take it with him when he goes. So he lived his life, he accumulated lots of money, and they put it in the coffin and buried it with him, and off to heaven he went. And so as he comes up to the pearly gates, as the story goes, St. Peter is waiting there with his check-in list, deciding who gets into heaven. And here comes this man with a very heavy trunk behind him. And St. Peter says, well, you can't bring that in here. And he says, yes, I can. I got special dispensation. God said I could, so I'm bringing it in with me. Call up to the front desk and you'll find out. So Peter calls up to the front desk and finds out, and God says, yeah, he can bring it in with him. And so Peter hangs up the phone and turns to him and says, well, you can bring it in with you if you want. But I just have to ask, for all the trouble you went to, could you please tell me what you got in there? And the man gleams with pride and throws the lid back, and gold coins spill out the edges onto the floor. And Peter stares at him a long moment and then finally says, your treasure is pavement? The idea being that in heaven they use gold to pave the streets. And so what the man dragged all the way to heaven with him was no better than asphalt. The point being that when our spirits transition out of this life, or even within this life, each of us experiences a number of different contexts. And in each context, there is something that we need, and there is a whole lot of stuff that we don't. And if we hold on to what we don't need, it keeps it from somebody who may need it. And so to show yourself as a decent, genuine, good person, you have to be willing to share what you simply don't need. On a similar note, I saw a little anecdote about the anthropologist Margaret Mead, who is widely respected and highly revered and greatly remembered. And somebody asked her once, what is the first sign of civilization? And they were expecting something like pottery or writing or metal or some advancement. And she said, a broken femur that is healed. And they were like, what? And she said, yes. In the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you're as good as gone. You're food for predators. You cannot run from danger. You cannot go to the water hole for water. You can't gather your own food. You can't survive. The only way that you can survive a broken leg in the animal kingdom is if someone or something carries you to safety and protects you until you're healed. So in her eyes, the first sign of civilization was somebody who had a broken bone that had healed. Because without someone taking care of them and watching out for them and providing what they could not during their time of healing, they would not survive. And we would be no more than a bunch of animals fighting for survival. And I just thought it was such an incredibly insightful moment, that when we are kind to each other and when we help the one who cannot return our kindness, that shows us to be more human than anything else we could ever do. Anything we could ever paint, anything we could ever make, anything we could ever write. Showing kindness is where it all begins. It's a virtually universal quality, because to draw from an excerpt of the principles of the Interstellar Alliance within the television show Babylon 5, it mentions that every voice enriches and enables us, and every voice lost diminishes us. And so the bottom line is that we have to be kind to one another. We have to help each other survive, because every voice that we can include becomes a voice that empowers and ennobles and enriches us and makes it possible for all of us to survive. If you talk to people who have studied biodiversity, they will tell you again and again that biodiversity is essential for survival. And the more species that go extinct, the more difficult it is for the rest to survive. Some of those species, especially the human one, are very spiritually oriented. But the whole point is we need to take that biodiversity from the physical realm and apply it to our economic realm and our ideological realm and our spiritual realm. And we need to have diversity in all things, because every voice that we have enriches and ennobles and empowers us, and every voice lost diminishes us. I hope that you've heard some things in the last half hour that are helpful and empowering to you. Thank you very much for watching.